Finance Minister, joins us. Minister, thanks so much for your time. You told us late last week that you wanted to keep that job you have. And so what are your priorities now in this third term of the coalition government in your particular portfolio?
Well, our priority as a government is to deliver on the commitments that we made to the Australian people in the lead up to the election, and that is that we will continue to build a stronger economy to secure our country's future. Now, in my own portfolio specifically, obviously together with the Treasurer, our job will be to deliver the surplus budget to ensure that funding for all of the essential services Australians rely on is sustainably provided within our budget, and to ensure that the economy is as strong as it can be.
An interesting move by the Prime Minister to move emissions reduction back into energy alongside the energy portfolio. It's been seen as a sign of him being able to exercise his now very strong authority over the government. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, it's obviously it's common sense. It makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Angus Taylor is the Minister for Energy, and now with responsibility also for the to meeting our emissions reduction targets. Has all of the necessary skills, experience, and background, and of course, there's alignment. There's policy alignment, so it makes a lot of sense. And Snowy 2.0 is obviously a central part of our plan to meet our emissions reduction targets committed to in Paris, and so there's a lot of alignment there.
So you feel you can continue to strike the right balance between supporting the argument of many of your Queensland colleagues to, back projects like Adani, for example, but still say that you do treat emissions reduction as a keen priority of this government, given the commitments that have been made internationally?
Well, we are and always have been committed to effective action on climate change, but we are committed to effective action on climate change in a way that is economically sensible. And of course, we can continue to develop our key export markets by continuing to boost production in relation to our key export products. But we are committed to meeting our emissions reduction targets signed on to in Paris, and we have a plan to meet those emissions reduction targets through our climate solutions package, including our climate, obviously our climate, our emissions reduction fund. And indeed, if you look at the way we've approached this area of policy, we have been able to meet and exceed our emissions reduction targets signed on to in Kyoto, and indeed we are on track to meet our emissions reduction target signed on to in Paris.
And another focus in this reshuffle has been the NDIS. A number of people in the disability sector over the last 24 hours warmly welcome this focus. Clearly it's an issue and a priority for the Prime Minister. What's your number one concern when it comes to the NDIS as the Finance Minister? As you see that project, that massive project being rolled out, what's the number one concern there?
Well, the implementation of the NDIS is a massive undertaking. It is a very significant social reform. It's a social reform which has got strong bipartisan support. But, obviously, when you move from what used to traditionally be an area of state-based block funding to various service provider organisations to a fully integrated national demand-driven program to ensure that all Australians with a disability have appropriate levels of support. There is, obviously, there are a lot of issues throughout that implementation process that need to be dealt with, and we do believe that there are, improvements necessary in terms of the delivery of services on the ground to ensure that all Australians do get the appropriate level of support as efficiently and as appropriately as possible. And Stuart Robert, as the Cabinet Minister with dedicated responsibility to help ensure that happens, will provide a very, very important driver for that. He will be the key driver to ensure that happens, that we meet our target of 500,000 Australians supported through the NDIS by 2024-25.
On a couple of other issues, we saw the clearance rate in property terms at the weekend in some of the cities increase off the back of the election. Do you put a direct correlation between the election result and the better property results we're seeing already, or is this something happening separately in terms of a bottoming out of the market?
It's a clear indication of how concerned Australians were about the high taxing agenda and the impact it would have on the property market of the Labor Party. I mean, anecdotally, I can cite that over this past week, a whole series of people have walked up to me on the street expressing relief that the Labor agenda targeting the housing market in particular, with changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, would not now be implemented. I mean, the level of relief across the community was palpable, that Labor's housing tax would not be implemented because we have been elected on our agenda of lower taxes, stronger growth, and indeed making sure that Australians have the best possible opportunity to get ahead.
There is a backdrop, though, isn't there, of ongoing uncertainty. We saw the nice reaction to President Trump in Tokyo, but there are severe tensions, not just with China, but between the US and Japan as well. And they threaten to undermine the free trade framework, which has benefited our nation so much over the last few decades.
Well, free trade is important for the world. It's important for Australia, and we will continue to be an unequivocal advocate for open markets and free trade. And to the extent that there are issues that need to be resolved, we would like to see them resolved within the framework of our rules-based trading system. But you're right. I mean, there are always downside risks. There are some particular downside risks at present, and that is, of course, why it's important that domestically in Australia we do everything we can to ensure that our policy settings make us competitive and strong and resilient to face whatever challenges come our way in the future.
Your friend, the ambassador to the United States, Joe Hockey, wraps up at the end of the year, replaced by Arthur Sinodinos, and also taking on a senior role in New York is going to be Mitch Fifield, the outgoing communications minister. Why are those two individuals the best ones to undertake what can be a tricky job, and that is trying to deal with the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, they're obviously two outstanding, very experienced and accomplished public servants, and they do have the skills and the experience required to fulfill what are very, very important jobs. I mean, in particular, the job as ambassador to the United States to be taken up by Senator Arthur Sinodinos. Yes, I mean, it's an incredibly important job, and Arthur, through a long history of distinguished public service to Australia, has obviously collected the level of experience as well as the skills and background to do an absolutely outstanding job.
There was some suggestion that you might have been mentioned in the mix for that. Was that something raised with you at any point? No.
No, that was a completely inaccurate story. I have never asked. I've never been interested. I wouldn't have said yes, and the Prime Minister never considered it. It was a complete and utter invention.
Okay, well that's not beating around the bush. Okay, and let's conclude now, if we can. Your thoughts on the Prime Minister travelling to the Solomon Islands next week, wanting to reassert our presence in the region. Is it all a bit too little too late, given the Chinese efforts in the Pacific, though, in recent years?
Well, obviously, I mean, our step up in the Pacific is, one of our top foreign policy priorities under the Morrison government. And, this is our neighbourhood. These are our friends in our neighbourhood. We're providing a record $1.4 billion worth of aid into the Pacific, and, our relationships across the Pacific with our immediate Pacific neighbours is the best it's ever been. And the Prime Minister, with his visit to Honiara, is continuing to build on what has been a very strong start under his leadership.
Mathias Cormann joining us live from Perth. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you later in the week.